This is London Calling Station WHO, Des Moines, Iowa. Each week at this time, visitors to Britain from the United States and Canada talk back home. Today our guest is Jack Shelley, manager of the news department for station WHO, Des Moines, Iowa, and accredited war correspondent with the United States. Mr. Shelley is at present in London en route for the forces battlefronts, and his talk today is on the subject of Allied cooperation. The United Nations in War and Peace. Stand by now for North American Guest Night with guest speaker Jack Shelley.
I must confess to you at the outset that the first reactions of one so newly arrived in the United Kingdom as I, on being asked to appear on this North American Guest Night broadcast, are mingled emotions of gratification and dismay, mixed with my pleasure at being allowed to address the large North American audience of the British Broadcasting Corporation, is a sincere feeling that I have scarcely been in Britain long enough to make a sound evaluation of the things I have seen and heard. As a professional newsman, I have always had a healthy suspicion of the alleged expert on matters foreign, who arrives in a strange country one week, leaves it the next, and then proceeds with the greatest of assurance to tell us what the people of that country think about everything from international relations to jitterbug dancing. For myself, I hope you will excuse me if I do not try to sell you such a bill of goods. Arriving in wartime Britain from the comfort and security of the American Middle West frankly presents the newcomer with the same kind of wildly uncoordinated impressions as the blind men in the famous old story, each of whom felt different parts of an elephant's anatomy and proceeded to describe the animal on the basis of what he touched. But from the start, of course, one thing is obvious: that Britain has been, is, and will be, until the end of the European struggle, a target of the enemy, and a tremendously important base, at which the Nazi will always try to strike, with any means at his command. From the time the new visitor first gropes his way through a London blackout, through the succession of days when he observes more and more the shattered buildings and the open areas which tell the story of German bombs, the feeling grows ever more compelling that here are a people who have felt far more than mere words can tell of the suffering that war brings. And as occasional flying bombs keep on falling in southern England, and the Nazi begins to experiment with his erratic new bombs, the admiration of an American correspondent for the dogged courage of the British people likewise increases by leaps and bounds. To an American also, another factor appears. The civilian population of Britain need never fear any loss of the respect and affection of their men and women in the armed forces. For the combat units know full well that their people back home have borne with them the fury of the German attack, have suffered, yes, and died, with the same devotion to duty displayed by those in uniform. And the fact that we civilians in America have not had this same experience of sharing the misfortunes of war with our fighting men is not all to the good, in spite of its obvious advantages. Every thinking American knows that in the security of our home front lies the very real danger of a gulf of misunderstanding between civilian and soldier. And any correspondent who talks with American combat troops in this European theater learns very quickly of their frequent fears that the people back home, to put it in their own words, just don't know there's a war on. Much of that feeling, I am afraid, grows out of faulty reporting. A great deal more of it comes about through a situation which is bound to occur when any great nation is more or less protected by two enormous oceans. But the feeling is there nonetheless, and it is not a pleasant one to report. Amid her sacrifices and her suffering, Britain can take at least some satisfaction in the knowledge that this is one post-war problem she will not have to face. Even a short stay in wartime England also makes clear to any observer the colossal value of this island base from a purely military standpoint for operations against the foe who once held almost all of Europe in his fist. The sight of uniforms from all over the globe on the streets of London, the occasional glimpses of the staggering concentrations of military supplies and materiel that are funneled through Britain to Europe, the American and British planes that roar overhead day after day, all these merely prove again what D-Day demonstrated beyond all doubt, that Britain was a launching platform whose very existence was necessary if Hitler was to be destroyed. And when one thinks of how this platform has made possible the great military campaign that has already brought Allied armies across the German border in at least one sector, Even the veriest tyro at the business of war shudders to think what might have been the story if Britain had not held in the dark days of 1940. How staggering would have been the loss of this outpost of freedom's armies. How dark might have been the future of all the democratic world. I have already had occasion to remark in an earlier broadcast through BBC to my own radio station, WHO, of the contribution of the British dominions to the Allied war effort. I saw a remarkable example of this in a recent visit to a Royal Air Force fighter base. There I saw flyers whose homelands sounded like a roll call of the British Commonwealth of Nations. Australians, New Zealanders, and of course many from that dominion for which we Americans have such a neighborly affection, Canada. All of them wore the blue. All of them wore the blue. All of them wore the blue of the RAF. 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 And flying beside them from the same base, and sharing the same mutual respect for their qualities as fighting men, were Polish aviators. They had come, most of them, from thousands of miles away, to fight thousands of miles away, to fight the same battle side by side with their English comrades, against the foe they knew to be equally the enemy of each of them. And on many occasions they had taken their fighter planes into the skies above Europe to fly as escorts for the mighty bombers, the fortresses and liberators of the United States Army Air Forces. I couldn't help feeling, as I heard the story of this Allied cooperation in the skies, that here, if we only have the sense to see it, and this time I think we have, was the pattern for the sort of teamwork that free men must preserve if we are to keep the peace that is being earned at so great a price on the battlefields of this war. It is a pattern that we Americans have also had before us. We Americans have also had before us in the federation of our 48 states and the welding together of diverse elements from all over the world into one mighty nation. Practical basis of this Allied team is simply that it's to the advantage of all of us, regardless of our minor differences, to keep it a going concern. Truthfully, I think that is the only sensible basis on which to form the whole framework. It is all very well to say the British and American peoples, for example, share the same language and the same general outlook on life. But I think that any Briton who has rubbed elbows with the thousands of Yanks who have crowded this country in recent years will tell you the thing that has struck him most is how different we really are, and neither of us would have it any other way. By the same token, there have been plenty of differences among Americans themselves. As history is recorded, we even fought a civil war over some of them. But all of us have long since decided that we are far better off, individually and collectively, under a federation of states, and with a system of rules and laws which we all agree to respect. Moreover, there is this compelling factor to the whole business. The state of world society has now arrived at a point. The development of modern weapons of war has now become so great that, as old Ben Franklin remarked in the early days of American independence, we must all hang together or we will all hang separately. Anyone who has the slightest imagination, in this day when flying bombs are already being used by an aggressor nation, can see that the time has come when isolation is no longer merely unwise for any nation, but simply impossible. If, for example, this Allied team should be disbanded after the military victory is won, and the scientists of some new would-be world dictator are given 10 or 20 or 25 years in which to perfect the rocket as a means of surprise attack, there will certainly be no country in the world where democracy can be safe from sudden death. To say that the possibilities of these new weapons are frightening is to put it mildly. And how likely it is that after 2 world wars in which the power of America on the side of the democratic cause has been so impressively demonstrated, that we in the United States may be the first targets of such an attack. Personally, I am more and more convinced as I go my rounds in Britain that this great team we call the United Nations will be preserved. Not for just a few years after the war, but for many, many years to come. I know the British people, with all they have seen of modern war, are determined that virtually no sacrifice is too great to guarantee that a world of peace can be maintained by free men. And I have every reason to believe that Americans have the same conviction. And that emphatically includes what many Europeans used to call our isolationist Middle West, the region I am most familiar with. I don't think I am being unduly optimistic. In any event, I am inclined to agree with one young American Air Force pilot with whom I talked at dinner the other night. Optimistic, he said. I don't dare to be anything but optimistic. If I thought that when this thing is over, I was going to go home and raise a family, only to have another world war come along in 20 years or so, he said, I don't think I could face living any longer. And that, for this observer, just about sums it up. We of the democratic powers have got the team. We have shown what it can do in the fighting of a war. If we don't go ahead to show what it can do to preserve a world at peace, then indeed, the twilight of democracy will have come.
The talk you just heard was by Jack Shelley, manager of the news department of station WHO Des Moines, Iowa, and accredited war correspondent to the United States Forces. This is the British Broadcasting Corporation.
WHO, the voice for victory, Des Moines.
This is Jack Shelley, WHO's war correspondent, speaking to you from Paris. As I make these frequent broadcasts to you from overseas, I like now and then to tell you about some of the places where a war correspondent is quartered and the sort of people with whom he works. You see, I hope in a way to take you along with me on this trip, because without pushing the personal element unduly, I think perhaps you'll find it interesting and helpful to know some of the background that underlies the job I'm trying to do. And here in Paris, there's a focal point which forms a background for practically every news report you read or see, from a correspondent accredited to SHAEF, which is short for Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Forces. That focal point is the Scribe Hotel, spelled S-C-R-I-B-E, where almost every correspondent who comes to Paris is housed. The hotel, whose name has long been connected with journalism, has been taken over by the Army, although still, and some hundreds of reporters are here. They come from most of the Allied nations, and they represent radio, newspapers, and other news media. Here in the Scribe Hotel, they get the news issued by Supreme Headquarters. Here, mostly in the big workroom with many tables, they write their copy, just as I did this broadcast. Here they submit their stories to the censors, and if they're newspaper correspondents, here the cable and wireless companies send the approved copy to papers all over the world. And also here in the Scribe Hotel, we radio correspondents take our copy to small studios on one of the floors and broadcast to our listeners back home. Here also are the public relations officers who help correspondents get the stories they want and who often take them on special trips to certain sectors. The mail room, where we get our letters and cables. A pickup room for copy carried to the States by military plane. And in the basement, the mess where most of the correspondents eat. 3 times a day, the correspondents here gather in a large room whose walls are covered by maps. There, Supreme Headquarters officers, using large pointers after the schoolroom fashion, give the reporters what's called their briefing, the latest reports on what's going on along the Great Western Front. Then the correspondents for the great wire services and for radio networks and many individual news outlets rush out to write their summaries, dash with them to the censors, and send them off to the world. It's from these briefings that the correspondents for United Press and International News Service get the news that arrives a few minutes later in our newsroom at WHO, and from which our newscasts are largely compiled. There are other correspondents in the front areas, of course, but these reporters in the Scribe Hotel are the men who get the broad overall picture. And after attending a great many of these briefings and seeing the great mass of detail that's given them, my admiration for the skill and special knowledge of the correspondents for the great American news services has risen higher than ever. It's no easy job to sort out the important from the unimportant at these briefings and to write a summary that's brief, sound, and easily understood. This is the news center for the whole Western Front, and the men who hold down the jobs here know their business. Through the corridors of the Scribe Hotel these days pass some of the most famous names in the journalism world, both radio and press. In the last few days, for example, H.V. Kaltenborn, Leland Stowe, William L. Shirer, Virgil Pinkley, the United Press European manager, John McVeigh of NBC, Janet Flanner of the New Yorker magazine, Helen Kirkpatrick of the Chicago Daily News, and many others have been among the ever-changing scene. My roommate is J.R.L. Anderson, military correspondent for that famous English newspaper, the Manchester Guardian. And other top newspaper and radio reporters of Britain are on the job here at the Scribe. There are also photographers and artists coming in and out from their assignments to cover the pictorial side of the war. The other night, Floyd Davis, one of the best-known illustrators in America, showed me the drawings he made in his sketchbook while covering the fighting at Metz. Also here is his wife, one of America's leading women artists, who also is picturing the war. Likewise staying in the Scribe these days is one of Iowa's leading newspaper men, Ralph Lyson, managing editor of the Davenport Daily Times. He's in Paris for a brief stay after first coming to England as a guest of the British Ministry of Information. Here also I met a WAC officer from Iowa, Second Lieutenant Virginia Kincaid of Cedar Rapids. She is secretary to Colonel Dupuy, Chief of Headquarters Operations of the Shafe Public Relations Division. It was Lieutenant Kincaid, this Iowa girl trained at Fort Des Moines, who took dictation of the famous Communique No. 1, which announced that our landings in France had begun last June. You remember Colonel Dupuy read that communique to a waiting world on that historic morning, a brief, matter-of-fact announcement that in my memory will always be one of the great moments in radio's reporting of the news. And that's a brief picture of the Scribe Hotel in Paris. The center of the news coverage of this European war front. Let's hope it won't be long before these hard-working correspondents here can dash to the wires and the microphones with the word all of us will want to hear, the news of the end of the fighting over here. When that happy day comes, I don't think you need to doubt that they'll get it to you straight, and get it to you straight, and get it to you fast. This is Jack Shelley, WHO's war correspondent, speaking from Paris and returning you to Des Moines. Once again from a studio of the British London. Is commanding the attention of Americans in wartime London, would like to tell you tonight something about how the British people are saving for victory. And I think that in the energy and the sacrifice being displayed by these people here, who have suffered so much from a sheer physical those of us in the States can derive still another example of how determined we should be that our dollars shall be enlisted in the fight for freedom. On every hand in Britain, one sees displayed a very simple underground system, pasted on any number of places where the eye may fall. The legend of that poster numbers just half a dozen words. We've got to keep on saving. The sentiment that is being acted upon, whose effort in national savings, the counterpart of our war bond activities back home, is another of the proud records which fill every British fighting man with the calm assurance that his civilian comrades are backing him up to the very limit of their powers. I spent a good many hours the other day checking into the British war savings program, and I found it employs almost every one of the techniques we are using in America, plus perhaps a few others that we haven't employed. If you were working, for example, in a British war plant or shop or any other business, you almost certainly would be earmarking part of your wages under a payroll deduction plan, just as we do in the States. But in addition to the payroll deductions and being asked to invest additional amounts in special drives, you would find that every week or so, a volunteer collector in your place of employment would come around and ask if you didn't have an extra shilling or so this week, that you had to invest that also in war savings. I have the word of leaders in the savings campaign of London that as this energetic collection activity, based on personal contacts by volunteer workers, it's been one of the greatest strengths of the British effort. Each large industry or business has its own war savings collection plan. And here in London, every borough of the city has at least one savings center, where the working stores and smaller business places is directed. An enormous amount of the work in this whole campaign is done by British women. Both the savings centers I saw, for example, were staffed entirely by women who had volunteered their time to the cause. When you invest your savings in the war effort here in Britain, you can buy war savings certificates or stamps. Very much the same sort of thing as our war bonds and stamps. The certificates, for example, mature in 10 years, but they are issued in smaller denominations than ours. The smallest certificate is worth 15 shillings, about $3 American. At the end of 10 years, it'll be worth £1 and 6p, a trifle over $4, and the interest is tax-free. One can also buy defense bonds, costing £5 or about $20, and paying 3% interest a year. But this interest is subject to income tax. One of the more noticeable differences in the British method, however, is that post office savings and accounts are also treated as part of payroll deductions if the worker desires an account in the post office savings bank. But the British have put perhaps even more emphasis on use than we have back home. Free of charge, very attractive and with savings stamps, Christmas and birthday cards, and one can also buy sold for £37 in either certificate. As a result of all the various work of the volunteer assistance and on saving, British authorities war savings are still showing a definite increase after 5 long and bitter years. As an example, for the week ended November 5th, the United Kingdom, with an approximate population of only 14 million, saved some 14 million pounds, or about $52 million. It seems to me that's a remarkable figure for a country where hundreds of businessmen have seen their enterprises bombed out, and where all manner of persons have suffered, 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 and where all manner of persons have suffered direct and staggering financial loss through the action of the enemy, both here and abroad, both here and abroad, both here and abroad, both here and abroad. How much easier then it should be for Americans to do the job of war saving that is asked of us, job of war saving that is asked of us, job of war saving that is asked of us, job of war saving to our fight backing them. I tell American soldiers in the European theater, small pay, don't forget, are not doing all they can. You can answer them, and the sixth way is you can do it. This will likely be my last one, for I am leaving very soon for France. I hope to be able to speak to you from there as well. But in the meantime, goodbye from the studio of the British Broadcasting Corporation in London.
This is the British Broadcasting Corporation.
Stand by now for...
And now, in a few moments, we'll hear from WHO's own Jack Shelley speaking from BBC Place, London.
Greetings again, Ian Planbeck and all my friends to heard that hour. This is Jack Shelley speaking to you once more from the London studio of the British Broadcasting Corporation. One of the first things any American correspondent who arrives in London learns about the food situation is that while the British public is being adequately fed, it's by no means an easy thing to find in any British eating house anything like the kind of meal that you folks back in the States accept as a matter of course. Even in the more expensive restaurants, courses are sharply limited, the better grades of meat are rarely seen, and the vegetables and fruits that we Americans like so well are almost out of the question. But a U.S. correspondent here in London soon learns another thing, that there is one easily accessible spot where you can not only get the kind of meals Americans like, but where the price he is asked to pay is almost unbelievably low. That spot is the famous Consolidated Officers' Mess, operated by the United States Army in part of the Grosvenor House Hotel. That huge eating place is generally agreed to be one of the greatest food operations of this entire war, by any standard you care to apply. And without any question, it's the biggest officers' mess in the world. Perhaps the best tribute that's ever been paid to this London officers' mess is that to every American over here it's known by its nickname. They call it Willow Run, after the enormous aircraft factory near Detroit. And the nickname applies beautifully, for this food factory, if it might be called that, functions with the same amazing size, efficiency, and effortless speed as the original Willow Run bomber plant. Perhaps a few figures will give you an idea of how big this officers' mess really is. On the average, 6,000 American officers, correspondents, and other persons directly linked with the Army are fed here every day. Last Sunday, at one meal, almost 3,000 pounds of chicken were served, which means that about 750 chickens had to be provided for that single dinner. And about 200 gallons of coffee are consumed at every meal, to wash down the fine staples which make up the menu. Incidentally, this officer's mess is one place in England where an American can be sure of getting a cup of coffee he'll really like. And making good coffee, according to our ideas, is one thing the British still haven't mastered. Willow Run, to use its nickname again, makes its coffee in huge 25-gallon pots from its own special formula. And it's really good, with as many additional cups as you want. When you come into this great officer's mess and check your coat, you walk out on a balcony and look down on scores of tables, packed with hundreds of Americans eating in what certainly must be one of the biggest dining rooms ever seen. You go down the stairs on either side and enter one of two curving lines passing along the food counters. You pick up a tray, and from that moment you're on the assembly line that gave Willow Run its nickname. There's not a lost motion. As you pass down the counter, one woman employee places the meat course in one of the compartments of the metal tray, the next potatoes, and others vegetables, butter, and so on all the way through dessert. At the end of the line, you pay the cashier with British money, and it's then you have the pleasant surprise of learning this fine meal will also be one of the cheapest you've eaten since reaching London. Breakfast cost you 1 shilling and 6pence. That's about 30 cents in American money, and dinner and supper cost 2 shillings each, or about 40 cents American. And you can go back as often as you like for more helpings of everything but meat. As a sample, here was last Sunday's menu at the officer's mess. For breakfast, each man got a real honest-to-goodness orange, and in order to appreciate how welcome that is, you must understand that to people here in Britain, an orange is practically a museum piece. Also, there was hot oatmeal, a choice of dry cereal with plenty of canned milk to put on it, hot cakes, toast, butter, peach jam, and coffee. For dinner, there was fried chicken, giblet gravy, mashed potatoes, peas, cabbage and pineapple salad, and a salad of that kind is another rare treat over here, devil's food cake, bread or rolls with butter, cherry jam, and coffee or tea. And for supper, there was pea soup, corned beef, creamed potatoes, Brussels sprouts, endive salad, vanilla pudding, peanut butter, and the usual lineup of bread and a choice of hot drinks. Moreover, once or twice every week, there are real fried eggs for breakfast. Something else that's a rare treat in Britain. The eggs are cold storage, shipped from the States. And that brings up another remarkable angle of this operation. Virtually all the food served at this mess is transported all the way from America. And in order not to cut into the London civilian food supplies, only a few unrationed items, such as lettuce and occasional tomatoes, are bought here. In the country, however, reverse Lend-Lease provides quantities of fresh vegetables and salads. I might add in that connection that this has not been a good crop year for the British farmer in his gallant battle to keep up food production. It's been extremely wet, especially in the northern sections during harvest time, and this has added to the complications caused by labor shortages and all the other difficulties of British wartime farming. The meat and poultry used at the London officers' mess are shipped in frozen form from the States. Most of the vegetables are dehydrated, and the milk is either canned or powdered. But when they reach the table, they're as tasty as if these products were fresh from the farm. And one thing you Midwestern farmers can be sure of is that the foodstuffs and the meats you have done such a fine job of raising are really coming through. This big so-called Willow Run eating place, and all the officers' messes in London, are directed by Captain Francis Madden of Boston, Massachusetts. And the mess officer for Willow Run itself is First Lieutenant Lloyd Underhill of Mansfield, Ohio. Some 475 civilians are employed at this biggest of all officers' messes, most of them British. The U.S. Army personnel includes 4 officers and 7 sergeants, and 3 of the latter are WACs. The menus are made up from a master menu, drawn up by Quartermaster Headquarters of the Army. And you'll be pleased to know this is the same basic menu for our soldiers in the field. Here at this London officers' mess, the basic menu is studied, and in some cases modified on the basis of supplies, by a trained dietitian, who is a regular member of the staff. This dietitian is a woman officer, First Lieutenant Ethel Bolts of Archie, Nebraska. The chefs themselves are civilians, headed by an Englishman, and including Poles and Frenchmen among others. They work in 3 shifts of 8 hours each, so that any time, and 24 hours a day, there's always something cooking at the Consolidated Officers' Mess. It isn't much wonder it's one of the best places in all of Britain for a man who wants a good meal. That's just one story on how the food that farmers grow is reaching Allied soldiers far from home. It's a story that Americans and British alike have a right to be proud of, for it could never have occurred unless you food producers back home, and these hard-working farmers battling all kinds of handicaps here in Britain, were doing the biggest job in farm history. Thanks to your combined efforts, our fighting men are eating better than ever before in history. And now again, that's all from London today. This is Jack Shelley, speaking from a studio of the British Broadcasting Corporation, and returning you to Herb Planbeck and the Corn Belt Hour at WHO in Des Moines.